A presidential pilgrimage. Bill Clinton walks in the footsteps of history's fallen soldiers.
The tale that medals tell, stories of life and death from the liberation of France. To our viewers around the world, good evening. Today from Normandy, I'm Frank Sesno.
And I'm Hilary Bowker. Also ahead, a requiem in marble.
All imperfections past, they march now in faultless order, keeping the hard-won heights over Omaha Beach. A field of patterns, weaving their many origins into their common destiny.
CNN's Richard Blystone on the monuments of World War II. We are here at Colville, at the American Cemetery in Colville-sur-Mer.
And from this location over the next few days, we will be covering the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings, the invasion of Europe. This cemetery is one of the best-known symbols of that Allied assault on Normandy's beaches. It is here that more than 9,000 of the Americans who died in the 1944 battles are buried. The commemoration of the historic events of a half-century ago promises to make history of its own. A throng of heads of state and government will take part in the planned ceremonies. They will join thousands of veterans and tourists who will also come to remember what General Dwight Eisenhower called this great and noble undertaking. In this cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, President Bill Clinton will make the major address of his D-Day tour. Well, still ahead on the International Hour, two different perspectives on the Allied invasion of Normandy from the men who were here 50 years ago. One as a war correspondent, the other as a soldier.
And we'll take you to a village that has even more reason than most to remember the dark days of the war.
Two veterans of the D-Day landings are our guests today in Normandy. Reginald Lee was a member of the beach assault party when British troops stormed ashore at Sword Beach.
Jack Thompson was a war correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. He is the last survivor among correspondents who came ashore with U.S. troops here at Omaha Beach. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Thompson, if I could begin with you. I mean, here we are covering the interview 50 years later. It must have changed dramatically when you came ashore with the troops. Can you give us a brief description of what it was like?
It was like a cauldron in hell. The gun-colored bluffs were ablaze with grass fires, turning a lot of smoke all over the area. The machine guns were flaying the beach and flaying the ships as they came in, the little boats. The artillery shells were falling all over the place. And the mortar shells, which were one of the most horrible of weapons, because they could land so accurately on a man, were falling all over the beach and out in the water where other men were struggling to get ashore. That's the way it looked like at that time.
To Reginald Lee now, we should point out to our viewers that you join us from London, which is where you now make your home. Mr. Lee, we're seeing some of the wind here today that was the sort of thing that you experienced, plus a great deal more rain and very high seas as you came over. What was that crossing like? As I read, I'm impressed by the weather conditions and sheer fear that gripped most of the troops.
Well, the weather conditions certainly weren't that bad. There was a high sea running, but the storm that really put a really black thing on was about 3 or 4 days later. But the actual landing, there was a fairly high sea running, but it didn't cause a lot of trouble. The trip across wasn't too bad.
Mr. Lee, if I could come in here for a minute now. The view from the beach is very overpowering. You were 21 years old at the time. Just can you describe the feeling that you had when you came up and saw these bluffs in front of you and Germans on the other side?
Well, at that stage, there was certainly no sign of any Germans because due to the preliminary bombardment, most of the strong points there had been overrun. We had heavy sniper fire from all around, and also, as has already been mentioned, mortars were a nuisance. But having done this on so many exercises, a point to remember that as a beach group, we had training for many, many months beforehand, and it was instilled on us the task that we had to perform was to get in, dig in, and then immediately turn our attention to keeping exits clear on the beach and also from the assault craft. So your mind was continually on the job that you had to do.
Mr. Thompson, let me come back to you for just a moment. I was reading that you are the sole surviving reporter who came across onto Omaha Beach with the Americans on D-Day. I'm wondering what your sense of history was at the time.
At the time, the sense of history was rather dim because the action on the beach and all around us was so intense. And it was only later that we began to realize how important and how vastly important the success of this D-Day operation was. It was only after we had managed to win a toehold on this Omaha Beach, a little more than a mile inland in one place, and hold it all night, that we realized that, by golly, we had hit the most awesome charge of our life, and that we were holding it. This was the moment when you began to realize that the American GIs and their supporting arms of any kind were able to prevail over the planners who had done their utmost to make the planning protect everyone, although they knew it was going to be almost a disaster.
Mr. Thompson, there was a moment, in fact, in there when General Bradley fretted that this might end in disaster. As you were there on the beach, what did you think you would be reporting at the end of the day, if you were around to report it?
Why, the sense of disaster did not really last much longer than about the first 6 hours. After that time, you realized that the tides were turning, and we would be in there forever. But I don't blame General Bradley for being suspicious of the whole thing, because at that time he had not received the word that we had finally made a breakthrough from the beach up a narrow little path behind some German entrenchments conducted by a captain named Joe Dawson of the 1st Division, 16th Infantry Regiment. And he's the guy that led the first troops off of the Omaha Beach on that fateful day.
Rendleton Lee, if I could come back to you for a moment. You said that when the landing actually took place, you'd been in so many exercises that this was almost a continuation. But when did you really have a sense that this was not an exercise, that this was for real, and perhaps begin to understand the fact that you were actually making history?
Well, that was quite a time before, when they issued us with 2 100-franc notes back in the concentration areas back in England. So we really knew then we were in for, it was France, and we were then briefed. We were given the briefing in concentration areas in Britain, and that was, I suppose, towards the end of May, because we embarked around the 3rd of May, 3rd of June, sorry.
You make it sound now... please go on. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So, no, sorry. It was, as I say, once again, the issuing of the 100-franc notes and the fact that you were behind barbed wire and being guarded by your own troops outside, Pioneer Corps they were actually, which was a bit of an insult in those days, but nevertheless, we knew it was for real, and this was it. And then the briefing came, of course, but even then, all the various villages and towns, etc., that we were in our particular sector were given code names, but we nevertheless knew that it was France, and that was it.
You make it all sound so very matter-of-fact now. What were the emotions running, you know, through? What emotions did you feel, though, when you were actually taking a part of this? I mean, was it just the fact that you had a job to be done and focusing on that entirely, or did you feel fear? Did you feel elation when you were actually on the beach? What did you feel?
I think possibly, to be absolutely fair, the task which we had to undertake as a beach recovery section, our task was to help anybody on that beach in the same way that possibly you could say the medical corps, or your medics, as you call them, corpsmen. You had a task. You had to look after other people. It wasn't just looking after yourself. So your concentration immediately was on getting things clear, getting armoured vehicles, using the BARVs to tow stuff out, hitch on, help if you could to get, when the landing craft had dried out, to get casualties on. There was something going on the whole time. bearing in mind you had to look after yourself as well. But it was a necessary job, and it was helping others and making sure you kept that beach clear, and otherwise you'd have the beach master after you screaming and ranting as they used to, because they regarded it just as we did as our beach. He regarded it as his beach, and you had to keep that moving.
Mr. Thompson, you didn't have satellites back then. You didn't have fax machines. There was no real-time reporting, as we call it now. I'm wondering if you think, because of the way the media have changed, the way we do our jobs now, whether your kind of reportage and that kind of invasion could be mounted today.
I doubt very much if the two could go together today, because 50 years ago, we knew we were not going to be able to get any communication off the beach that morning, although the Army had a different viewpoint. They thought they would have messengers running up and down the beach after about 2 hours. And this was nonsense, of course. But I don't see how that could happen today with the electronic coverage that is so much available.
Did you have an adversarial relationship with those you were covering?
Not in the least. We had a very close relationship with all the people we were covering in the armed services and the political scenes as well. But we, in covering all the Army, and during that war and other engagements, the relationship between the press and the people they were covering was really a very cordial, non-antagonistic relationship.
Reginald Lee, if I could come back to you, and perhaps finally, do you have any personal memories, you know, just short little anecdotes that you could tell that is really still very much with you today, 50 years later?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think one thing that sticks in one's mind was, and it's not particularly pleasant, but the head of a commando, which he had been obviously knocked out in the wire on the beach, and at that stage one couldn't get out to these corpses that were out there, because being the last beach we were under sniper fire, and in the end they had to put out smoke over us for a long time, for 2 or 3 days. But it was very, very disturbing, shall I say, and that's putting it sort of mildly. This poor chap's head was gradually getting pickled each time the tide used to come in, and you were grateful for the tide covering it, and then the tide went down, and of course then flies would come, and each morning you watched the poor chap still had his berry in his lapel, and it was quite a thing that I shall always remember that. The other thing was that whilst having morning rations and sitting on the edge of the slit trench having your breakfast porridge block and whatever, and a couple of a jeep and a trailer came in with some airborne boys. There were 6 of them, and they came in seaborne, of course, and there was only just this a jeep and a light trailer, and they touched off a mine. Well, that mine was within about 100 yards of where we were working, and we all must have walked over the thing throughout those few days beforehand. It could have been any one of us, but it killed all of them, and it was quite a good start to that day, I can tell you. Very, very unhappy, very nasty.
Oh, well, on that note, Reginald Lee, thank you very much for joining us.
And Jack Thompson in Chicago, we appreciate your time as well. Thanks to you both.
And still ahead on the International Hour, terrible memories haunt French villagers who survived Nazi atrocities.
And the village remains unchanged, so others will not forget.